Welcome back to Mystery Vault, where we open the forgotten files of history, one chilling mystery at a time. Tonight's story takes us to Dublin, Ireland, in the late 1980s, a city of cobbled streets, rain-soaked alleys, and old institutions that had seen more than they ever told. Our case begins at a psychiatric hospital on the outskirts of town, a place known as St. Catherine's Asylum. In 1988, over a span of 6 strange weeks, 24 people, patients and staff alike, vanished from within its walls. No bodies were found. No official investigation was ever completed. And to this day, St. Catherine's remains sealed off, a decaying monument to unanswered questions. Was it negligence? A cover-up? Or something even stranger that history quietly erased? Let's open the vault. Shadows behind the walls. St. Catherine's Asylum was founded in 1903, at a time when mental health was still poorly understood. It stood alone in the Dublin countryside, a fortress of red brick, surrounded by tall stone walls and fields that once stretched to the horizon. At first glance, it looked like a place of care. But those who lived nearby whispered of screams on stormy nights and lights flickering in the upper windows long after midnight. Officially, the hospital treated the emotionally disturbed and socially unfit. Unofficially, it became a place where unwanted people could simply disappear. The poor, the mentally ill, and sometimes the inconvenient. By the 1970s, modern psychiatry was transforming across Europe. But somehow, St. Catherine stayed untouched, its methods, its staff, and even its secrecy. Former nurses recalled being told never to ask questions about certain wings, especially the East Ward, where long-term patients were housed. And then there was the lower level, a part of the hospital that few admitted even existed. Rumors described locked staircases, maintenance doors that led nowhere, and strange humming sounds from deep below the building at night. In the late 1980s, when records began to vanish and patients started disappearing, investigators later realized something chilling. The basement floor plan of St. Catherine's didn't match the original blueprints. Whole corridors existed that were never listed in the city archives. The story of those hidden passages, and the people who never came out of them, would soon turn St. Catherine's from a hospital into a legend. The disappearances begin. It started quietly, almost unnoticeably. In early October of 1988, a woman named Margaret Daly arrived at St. Catherine's Asylum to visit her brother, Patrick. He had been a patient there for nearly 3 years, committed for severe depression after the death of his wife. When Margaret arrived, the receptionist seemed confused. Patrick's name wasn't on the patient list. She insisted he was there. She had visited him only 2 weeks before. The staff promised to check the files. Hours later, a nurse returned and said Patrick had been transferred to another facility outside the city. When Margaret asked which one, there was no answer. The hospital couldn't find the transfer paperwork, and no record existed of Patrick leaving the building. She went to the police the next day. Officers made calls, checked local hospitals, and returned with the same conclusion. There was no record of Patrick Daly anywhere in the Irish health system. His file at St. Catherine's had vanished, as if it had never existed. Within 2 weeks, 3 more families came forward, reporting similar disappearances. Each time, the same explanation was given. The patient had been transferred. And each time, there was no destination, no signature, and no trace in the national database. Then, in mid-October, it wasn't just patients. A nurse named Bridget Malone, who had worked the night shift for 6 years, failed to show up for work. Her colleagues assumed she was ill. But after 2 days without contact, they went to her apartment. The door was locked from the inside. Her personal belongings were untouched, and her uniform was still hanging on the chair. She was never found. By early November, the number of missing people connected to St. Catherine's had risen to 24, 21 patients, and 3 members of staff. The Gardaí opened an internal inquiry. Investigators were sent to the hospital to review records, but what they found made the case even stranger. Entire sections of the patient registry were blank. Files from 1987 and 1988 had been removed or replaced with copies missing signatures and dates. Even the hospital's security logs were incomplete, entire nights missing from record. When questioned, the hospital director, Dr. Declan Rowe, stated that flooding in the basement archives had damaged records. Yet the police found no sign of water damage anywhere in the building. Rumors began to spread among the remaining staff. Some claimed the missing patients had been part of a new treatment program, one never mentioned in public reports. Others whispered about the West Wing, a section of the hospital sealed off in the early 1980s after an accident involving electrical systems. Those who worked nearby said they heard noises from behind its locked doors, a steady hum, like machinery running deep underground. By the third week of November, families began gathering outside the gates of St. Catherine's, demanding answers. The police increased their presence, but within a month, the inquiry was quietly closed. The official statement concluded that there was no evidence of criminal activity. The case disappeared from headlines as quickly as it had appeared, and by Christmas 1988, the public had already moved on. But inside the walls of St. Catherine's, those who remained spoke of something that didn't feel over. Some said new rooms had appeared on the lower floors, places no one remembered being built. Others claimed they could hear knocking from beneath the floorboards at night. And those who dared to speak about it didn't stay for long. The underground wing. After the inquiry was closed in 1988, St. Catherine's Asylum returned to quiet operation. Families stopped visiting. Several staff members resigned without explanation. And slowly, the hospital began to empty, not through patient recovery, but through transfers that no one could confirm. By 1990, less than half of the original population remained. The corridors that once echoed with footsteps and voices grew silent. Only a few nurses, maintenance workers, and the hospital's director stayed behind. Then came a discovery that would later define the legend of St. Catherine's, the discovery of the underground wing. It began when a team of electricians was sent to inspect wiring faults on the lower floors. During their inspection, one of the men noticed a doorway hidden behind a row of old storage shelves. The frame had been plastered over, but the shape of the archway was still visible beneath the wall. They reported it to the head of maintenance, who ordered the team to ignore it and continue their work. But curiosity got the better of them. Later that night, one of the workers returned alone with a flashlight and a crowbar. Behind the plaster was a heavy steel door, no markings, no labels, and sealed shut from the outside. The hinges were rusted, but the door had clearly been used at some point. What lay behind it, no one could say. Within a week, the electrician who had found the door resigned from his job and left Dublin entirely. His supervisor told police he had become deeply unsettled. He was last seen boarding a ferry to Holyhead in early 1991. In 1992, when the Irish Department of Health finally shut down St. Catherine's for good, government surveyors entered the site for decommissioning. They, too, found signs of hidden passageways below the main structure. The hospital's official blueprints showed only 2 basement levels, yet the surveyors discovered ventilation shafts leading much deeper into the ground. There were also traces of electrical cables running into areas not mapped anywhere in the plans. When they tried to follow these conduits, they reached concrete walls that had been freshly sealed. In their final report, one handwritten note appeared in the margin beside the diagram of the West Wing. It read, "Unlisted sublevel. Access not permitted." Years later, in 1998, a group of urban explorers gained entry to the ruins. Their accounts, though unverified, are consistent with one another. They described narrow tunnels lined with rusted pipes, collapsed ceilings, and doorways leading to rooms that seemed deliberately concealed. Inside, they claimed to have found hospital beds with restraints still attached and faded markings on the walls, initials, dates, and tally marks scratched into the paint. No photographs from that expedition have ever surfaced. Shortly after their visit, the building was sealed again under government order, citing structural instability. To this day, no official statement has been released explaining why the underground sections were never documented. But one thing is clear: the hospital was far larger than anyone had been told, and whatever was happening beneath St. Catherine's was never meant to be found. The missing files. When St. Catherine's Asylum officially closed its doors in 1992, the public was told that the decision came down to budget cuts and outdated infrastructure. But among those who had worked inside, few believed that story. There was something else, something buried within the hospital's records, that never made it into the reports. After the closure, all documents were supposed to be transferred to the Irish Department of Health Archives. Thousands of patient records, treatment logs, and administrative files were packed into boxes and labeled for storage. But when the archives were opened for cataloging in 1994, an entire decade of records was missing. Everything from 1979 to 1989 had vanished. No transfer receipts, no courier documents, and no paper trail of any kind. Even a shipping company hired for transport denied ever receiving the boxes. What survived were only fragments, scattered notes, and signed memos, and incomplete files that painted a confusing picture. Among these fragments, investigators found repeated references to something called the reconditioning program. There were no explanations of what it was, only short notations beside certain patients' names. Approved for RP, RP Phase 2, monitor behavior post-RP. One letter, dated March 1988, and addressed to Dr. Declan Rowe, read simply, "All RP participants must remain on site until further evaluation. Do not move subjects without authorization. Transfer orders suspended." The letter bore no government seal, only a code, MH/1988/117. Researchers who examined it decades later were never able to trace that code to any known department or funding source. In 2003, following a wave of public interest in Ireland's institutional history, several of St. Catherine's internal documents were quietly declassified. Hidden among them was a short report from a hospital administrator describing an experimental study involving trauma response and controlled sensory environments. The paper mentioned the use of isolation chambers and neurological stimulation, terms suggesting a primitive form of behavioral or memory research. What caught historians' attention wasn't the experiment itself, but the dates. The study was marked as ongoing from 1986 to late 1988, the exact period when the disappearances occurred. No author was listed on the document. Instead, the signature space contained 3 letters written in pen, Dr. Decades later, when journalists tried to locate Dr. Declan Rowe, they discovered he had retired to a small town outside Galway in 1993. He gave only one interview before his death in 2007. When asked about the missing patients, he replied, "There are some places in this country that should be left in peace. St. Catherine's is one of them." Not long after his death, a sealed box was found in his personal belongings. Inside were hospital ID badges, handwritten notes, and a list of 24 names, the exact number of people reported missing in 1988. Each name was marked with a red line and a single word beside it, completed. Authorities seized the box, but its contents were never made public. Today, researchers still debate what reconditioning meant or how far the experiments inside St. Catherine's truly went. Some believe it was part of a forgotten psychological study funded by private research firms. Others think the program's purpose was far darker, not to heal the human mind, but to erase parts of it entirely. Whatever the truth, it seems clear that those missing files weren't lost by accident. Someone made sure that what happened in those years would never be fully known. The survivor's silence. After the closure of St. Catherine's Asylum in 1992, many believed the mystery had ended with the building's decay. But in the years that followed, a handful of people began to step forward. Individuals who claimed to have lived within those walls and survived what others did not. Their testimonies were scattered, inconsistent, and often filled with confusion. Yet behind their words ran a common thread, memories of something that never appeared in official records. The first survivor to speak publicly was a woman named Eileen O'Rourke, admitted to St. Catherine's in 1987 for severe anxiety. In a 1999 interview, she described long periods she could not remember, days and nights that simply vanished from her memory. When she asked the nurses what had happened, she was told she had been under observation. Eileen recalled waking up in a dim room she had never seen before. The walls were concrete, the light came from a single bulb, and the air was heavy with a smell she described as chemical and damp. She remembered voices behind glass, not angry or panicked, but measured, as if reciting instructions. Then nothing. In later years, when she saw photographs of the hospital's lower levels, she recognized them immediately. She said, "That was where they took us when the treatment failed." No record of such rooms exists in her medical file. Another patient, Thomas Byrne, spoke to investigators in 2005. He had been admitted for minor delusional episodes in the early 1980s and transferred out before the hospital closed. According to Thomas, patients chosen for special care were given injections before being moved to what staff called the quiet wing. He described hearing machinery beneath the floors, a low vibration that continued through the night. He also recalled a tall man in a gray coat who visited those rooms regularly, carrying a metal briefcase. When shown photos of the former director, Dr. Declan Rowe, Thomas hesitated and said he looked like him, but older. Several survivors shared another disturbing similarity. Each reported identical recurring dreams years after leaving the asylum. In those dreams, they found themselves standing in an endless hallway lined with closed doors. Behind every door came a faint humming sound. When asked what lay beyond the doors, none could ever recall, only that they were not supposed to open them. A journalist who interviewed 3 of the survivors in 2006 noted that all of them paused when describing certain events, as though their memories simply stopped mid-sentence. Neurological assessments later found mild gaps in short-term memory and signs of trauma-linked amnesia, though no direct cause could be identified. One of the nurses who had worked at the hospital during its final year also came forward under anonymity. She confirmed that a restricted treatment area existed in the basement, reserved for patients who responded poorly to conventional care. When asked what kind of procedures were carried out there, she refused to elaborate, saying only, "Some people came back different. Some didn't come back at all." Of the 24 people officially listed as missing in 1988, none were ever located. But several former staff members claimed to have seen 1 or 2 of them alive in the years that followed, living under new names in other parts of Ireland. Those sightings were never verified. Whether these survivors were truly part of the missing group or simply victims of confusion remains uncertain. What is certain is that every story, every fragment, points back to the same place: the underground levels of St. Catherine's, where the past and the truth were sealed away together. The reopening and the myths. After St. Catherine's Asylum was closed and sealed in the early 1990s, the site stood untouched for more than a decade. The once grand building slowly decayed. Windows shattered, vines crawled through the cracks, and the iron gates rusted in the rain. Locals said that no matter how many years passed, the air around the property never felt still. People avoided walking near it at night. Taxi drivers refused to stop on the old hospital road. In 2004, the Irish government quietly sold the land to a private investment firm based in London. The sale was not announced publicly, and few paid attention until heavy machinery appeared on the property the following year. The company, registered under the name Linbridge Holdings, claimed it planned to build a new research and rehabilitation center. But according to county records, no such center was ever approved. Instead, the area was classified as a restricted redevelopment zone. Construction workers who took the initial contract later told reporters that parts of the site were already reinforced underground, with power lines and ventilation systems still active. One worker described entering what looked like a service tunnel and finding doors marked with faded hazard signs, the same kind used in laboratories, not hospitals. When he mentioned it to his supervisor, he was told never to return to that section again. Within months, the work stopped. The machinery disappeared, and the property was surrounded by new fencing topped with cameras. No explanation was given, and the firm that purchased the land dissolved 2 years later. Since then, ownership has passed through a series of shell companies, each more obscure than the last. Residents living nearby began to notice unusual activity at night. Unmarked white vans were seen entering through the south gate. A faint blue light could sometimes be seen flickering from the upper floors, though there was no power line connected to the old grid. One man walking his dog reported hearing rhythmic sounds, like generators turning beneath the ground. When local police were called to investigate, they found nothing but tire marks and disturbed soil near the foundation. Over time, stories grew, whispered accounts that blurred the line between fact and folklore. Some said the government was using the site for advanced neurological research. Others claimed it was a storage facility for medical waste. And then there were the stranger versions, that the asylum had been built over ancient catacombs, or that the missing patients were never dead, only asleep beneath the floors. None of these stories have ever been proven. But what fuels the myth is how quickly every attempt to uncover the truth is stopped. Journalists who have tried to enter the site report that requests for access are denied. Drone footage taken in 2018 shows the outer structure still standing, though now heavily reinforced with new roofing and sealed entryways. Even today, the Irish Department of Health lists the land as inactive medical property, security restricted. No tours, no redevelopment, no demolition. Just silence. For some, the mystery of St. Catherine's has become a ghost story, a tale of old medicine and forgotten souls. For others, it remains a warning about what can happen when secrecy becomes stronger than accountability. And while the world has changed, the asylum has not. It sits quietly beyond the trees, watching the city that has long tried to forget it. The forgotten truth. Time is a way of softening even the darkest stories. Buildings crumble, papers fade, and memories scatter until all that remains is rumor. But some places refuse to disappear quietly. St. Catherine's Asylum is one of them. Decades after the final patient left its halls, questions still linger. What truly happened to the 24 people who vanished in 1988? Were they victims of an experiment gone wrong? Were they quietly relocated, their identities rewritten? Or was it something simpler, something human, that spiraled into myth over time? Researchers who have studied the case continue to find contradictions. Official records confirm the asylum's closure, but contain no mention of disappearances. Local newspapers from that year show small reports of administrative confusion at a Dublin hospital, but none names St. Catherine's directly. And yet, the testimonies of families, nurses, and the few survivors all describe the same period, the same silence, and the same fear. One historian who investigated the archives in 2015 found something odd. In the Department of Health's internal logs, there was an entry for St. C facility marked under a category called Project Restoration. The entry was dated 2013, 2 decades after the asylum closed. No explanation or follow-up was provided. When the historian requested more information, he received a short reply. Records unavailable. Site classified for redevelopment. No redevelopment has ever been seen. And so, the mystery endures, existing in the gray space between fact and legend. Each theory offers only fragments of an answer. Some believe St. Catherine's was part of an early neurological study into trauma suppression. Others say it was a holding site for patients moved from other closed institutions, lost in administrative chaos. And then there are those who think something happened underground, something meant to stay secret forever. Today, only the outer shell of the building remains. The windows are boarded, the paths overgrown, and the main gate chained. But every few years, new graffiti appears on the walls. Dates, names, and words like "still here" and "help us remember." No one knows who writes them. Perhaps they are vandals, or perhaps they are reminders that what we bury in silence does not always stay buried. The story of St. Catherine's is more than a tale of vanished people or lost records. It is a reflection of how easily truth can be erased when those in power control what is seen and what is forgotten. Maybe the real secret of St. Catherine's isn't hidden in its tunnels or its files, but in the way the world moved on, leaving questions unanswered and voices unheard. And so, the legend remains. The hospital that swallowed people. The asylum that time tried to forget, but never quite could. This was Mystery Vault. Every story we uncover is another door, one that leads deeper into the forgotten corners of history. If this story of St. Catherine's Asylum has left you with questions, you are not alone. Some mysteries are meant to be solved, Others are meant to remind us how fragile the truth can be. Thank you for watching. If you wish to keep exploring the unexplained, stay with us and keep the vault open.